Hello and welcome. My name is Maggie. My gamer tag is SnowQueenUS. I'm a variety streamer, but I favor cozy and simulation games. I have been streaming over on Twitch and playing Planet Coaster 2. Currently, Twitch has drops enabled for those who join Planet Coaster 2 live streams, so I'm hoping to build my channel a little bit by taking advantage of the drops while they are available and enticing those who are currently interested in the cosmetics to join me when I am actively live on Twitch. Currently, I've been trying to stream in the US afternoons a few days a week, and I'm hoping to stream some each weekend as well. With all that said, enough preamble, let's get into the speed build. Over on my live, I started a new sandbox island, which chat helped me name Disneyland Cuba. While on live, I placed a log ride blueprint and noticed how incredibly plain it was, and decided it could use some decorations to liven it up and make it more Disney-like. When I think of Disney, I think of attention to detail, and this ride just wasn't it. So I started looking through the scenery, and I found this animatronic Medusa scenery piece, which I felt fit very naturally with one of the areas on the ride, and an idea was born. We are going to continue to work on the mythology ride over on Twitch, but decorating these rides is very time consuming, so I figured I could record a speed build of a different ride which can be saved and added to Disneyland Cuba when the time comes. This River Rapids blueprint caught my attention when I was looking through the blueprints available. I felt like it would be a really good baseline for a little bit more love and decoration. I placed it down in an empty sandbox and added to it to make my own custom blueprint. I admit I did a tiny bit before I remembered to record, but I am still new to this and will get better over time. When I think of rapid rides, they usually have a basic nature theme. I looked through the nature scenery blueprints and picked one that I thought would work well for inspiration for the overall ride design. When I originally imagined decorating this ride, I planned on using mostly nature scene blueprints from the developers of the game and only creating filler for the gaps. But after I placed the 2 waterfall ponds, I realized I could take this design to a whole new level by almost exclusively custom building the decorations. Here you can see me struggling as I was trying to figure out where the panel was to change the color for the ride. It took me a little bit, but I was eventually able to find it. I feel like the reddish-orange pillars in particular just didn't fit with my overall vision for the ride. I ended up settling on greens and browns. It doesn't fully blend as much as I may have wanted it to, but I didn't want to stress too much about it. I do think I want to eventually update the rafts to fit with the color scheme a bit more, but I'm hoping to ask chat on Twitch once I place the ride to see if they have some color ideas to help just add a cute touch. My style for this build really involved just duplicating and resizing the various elements of the one inspiration piece. I found it fun and almost cathartic to take the pieces, copy them, and see them repurposed around the ride. The most frustrating part had to be the water that I placed around the majority of the base. I suspect I could have used terrain paint and tools, but I don't think terrain can be saved with the blueprint, and since my goal with this ride is to place it in another save file, I didn't want to risk placing the ride and not being able to get the terrain the same as I had it in this save. I am confident I can save the various decoration pieces all as one blueprint, so that was my overall strategy for the build. I do add rocks in the gap under the floating piece of scenery. I promised my live that I would try and build Disneyland Cuba as a serious park. I got a little crazy on my first play of Planet Coaster 2 because I got frustrated with controls, and then I noticed the bargain prices. When you have a 0 entry ticket price, for some of the rides, it was just insanely expensive. There was a flume, which is basically just a fancy name for a water slide, that was $38 per ride when I first put it down. And as I grew the park, that price actually went up. I think by the time I finished my live, the price for that flume was around $58 to ride this one water slide one time, which is absolutely insane. And this ride had an actual line of people waiting to ride it. I found myself just placing all of the rides willy-nilly just to try and see if I could find other rides that had an insane price like that flume. Needless to say, the first sandbox ended up a little bit of a disaster, and this time I really wanted to try and build a more realistic theme park. After I had been placing rocks for a bit, I did realize I needed to put down the base shape I wanted for the final ride. I decided to use the water bricks, and so you're going to see me add just an insane number of the water blocks. I had been bouncing back and forth a little bit at first, but I realized every time I stopped placing the water and placed something else and tried to come back to the water, there was this weird visual glitch that was happening because I just found it really hard to get the piece at the exact same level again. So I decided I needed to stop bouncing back and forth and just put down all the water bricks. I was pleasantly surprised to find this item existed and will absolutely be bringing this piece out during my live to enhance the log ride. I imagine it will be a go-to item when it comes to building out any sort of water feature in the future. I chose the water bricks as the base for the ride because it seemed right to me that rapids would be in a large watery area. Obviously, not realistic. Rapids are typically one direction, but it is consistent with many of the rapid rides that I have seen. I knew I could delete the bricks if necessary as I fleshed out more of the other pieces of scenery, but I was trying to avoid the general frustration that I was having with the water. I did have to add a few bricks later, but laying the full foundation for the ride with these bricks really helped me to start imagining what the final product might look like. By the time I am finished with this ride, it is over-decorated in the context of what the game requires for the full scenery points. But I'm still going for that Disney-esque theme of over-decorated attention to detail, so I felt it was necessary to push well beyond what Planet Coaster requires or minimums for the ride, and instead going for a really fleshed out and heavily decorated version of the ride itself. I spent enough time laying bricks that I actually cut about a third of the time that I spent putting down the space water from this speed build for video length. I did my best to minimize the screen jumps with some cuts creatively placed, but I do have to offer a little apology. I am playing this on console and there's a little bit of a learning curve. Additionally, I've noticed the PC handles the camera a little differently than the console, so I am still getting the hang of the controls and the jumping does get a little better over time. It has been a few years since I played a Planet Coaster game, and the last time I played, I definitely used more of the scenery blueprints when I decorated rides, and I didn't really try and push the decoration bounds like I am for this build. I lost count of the number of rocks I placed while trying to build out this ride. I imagined the rocks were sort of holding the water in place to make sure it didn't spill everywhere and overflow into the park. Yes, I am aware that is not the real mechanics of the game, but it helped me with my imagination of how this ride was built and laid out. With each rock I added, I felt like I got better with the controls of the game. The locking to surfaces is just a little finicky, and if the camera ends up in the wrong position, the decoration jumps to a new place, and unfortunately the screen jumps with it. Part of the reason I really wanted to work on the speed build off of live was to try and remind myself of how the controls work and just improve my overall skills. I really wanted to make this live experience better for viewers as we continue to build out that mythology-themed ride and hopefully more rides to come. I feel like there are a lot of nuances to the controls and the overall process for trying to design a ride from the individual scenery pieces, and I know I have a lot of room for overall growth as a player. I took this speed build as an opportunity to focus on learning the controls better and figuring out a way to make the final ride just look cohesive and kind of realistic. I found there are some tricks with the console controls. Specifically, I would turn on the stick to surface and align to surface, get the item in the general place I wanted it to be, and then turn off those controls so I can spin and move the item up and down to avoid those weird glitches I was being frustrated by. I ended up getting pretty frustrated on my live the other day. There was this built-in pond area where we were trying to build a rundown mythological garden, and as I was trying to put the plants in the water, they were sticking to the surfaces really strangely and in a different way than I expected. I would raise up the plant to try and have it float on the top of the water, and then it would immediately snap back down into the water before I had a chance to place it. Thankfully, throughout this build, I was able to figure out how to make that stop happening. So I'm really excited to continue building on live again. I might actually delete out some of what we did before and chase an end product that I'm really proud of. I should be able to upload the final blueprints to the Frontier Workshop, which means if you end up liking the final ride and wanted to add it to your own park, you would be able to find it and download it for your own gameplay. This build took me about 4 hours from start to finish. Once I started trying to place all of an item before moving to the next, it seemed to pick up pace. I found I wasn't stopping to look through the catalog or picking different pieces all the time. Instead, I just started playing with scaling and orientation of a single decoration, filling out everywhere I felt it would fit for the whole ride before moving on to the next piece. I learned to really utilize the scaling feature. It allowed me to use the same pieces over and over again without feeling too repetitive, and I really liked the final product. There were a couple of areas where I tried for these rock overhangs, which I think are pretty typical of rapids. I actually liked the end results. I could have probably added a water feature here as well, but being my first free build, searching through the special effects box wasn't on the agenda yet. In the future, I may reimagine this ride again to really see how far I've come as a builder. I did notice it clipped through the guests' heads later, so I had to move it up a little bit from its initial location, but I did not eliminate the overhang in the final ride. As I was placing rocks, I was trying to think about where a rock feature might make sense to justify the twists and turns of the ride. Towards the end of bulk placing all of these rocks, I stuck a few deliberately to support pillars at the base of the water, and I liked the touch that it added. In the future, if I were to rebuild, I may actually extend those rock features fully up to the base of the ride to try and hide the majority of the supports. In an effort to avoid this video being overly long, I am not including every single rock I placed around the ride, but you can kind of see throughout the video here a sense of what I did to place all of the rocks. After placing the majority of the rocks, I did take a bit of a break to start placing some of the water plants in areas around the ride. Taking a few hours to decorate a single ride really does lend itself to the trust the process mentality, but the ride was feeling plain, and I was worried those open stretches of water were just too much. Adding in the plants did help to break it up as I hoped it might, and I felt less inclined to hide more of the water under rocks once I had placed these plants. I built this over the course of a day, and build fatigue is real. When you've been staring at something this long, you start to doubt yourself regardless of skill level, and frankly, I'm still quite new to this. I'm decorating around my little Easter egg here. The base ride had these shipwrecked boats at the entrance, and I thought it might be fun to bring that element into another area of the ride. So, down in this valley, which is at the base of a large drop, I added 2 of these boats among the rocks as if they crashed and were left by previous people taking the rapids. I wasn't able to figure out how to add the scenery directly to the ride when I originally started building, so instead most of the pieces were simply added to the scenery group that I had placed from the blueprint catalog. I had saved rearranging that initial piece for the end, and one unfortunate discovery I made was every time I tried to move a piece, it would jump to a view of the whole ride. I edited out those screens for better viewing experience, no one needs to see that, but I did learn that if you're making these large scenery pieces, it actually can be sometimes better to delete the piece rather than trying to move it around, because those small nudges are accomplishable, but if you're moving it far, it's just not worth the time. I've transitioned to that area under the initial waterfall I placed where I wanted to put the water around the queue. This is another one of those areas that was tedious. The camera kept jumping everywhere and it was really frustrating to place, but I think once I put that rock terrain paint under it, I really do think it's going to be a really cute little detail that I've added to the ride. I'm starting to feel a light at the end of the tunnel by this point. I still need to place the majority of the foliage, but the overall vibes had me feeling optimistic about the final product. While I was making the queue area, I knew I needed to just finish out some of those buried rocks, but I was feeling more confident about my camera and build skills, so the time came to just fill in those final spaces, block off the area where you could see the clear edges of those water blocks, and start working towards that clean final product. Channeling real rapid rides, this rider platform just felt out of place. When placing rocks, I did add a couple of rocks to the platform to remind myself that this was something I wanted to do. But at this point, I decided I wanted to try and finish burying that unused side of the platform under rocks to really just make it blend a little bit more into the environment area. I finally moved on to placing those larger trees. I wanted to use the trees to break up the space further. I didn't worry about root systems, and there are trees growing out of rock, but I liked the vibes. I could have added bushes around the bases, but the appearance didn't bother me, so I left them alone. The foliage was where I really started playing with those game mechanics. When placing rocks, I mostly left on the stick and aligned to surface toggles to allow the object to spin and rotate freely to add that diversity to the build. But the plants had a tendency to clip. They would either be too far into the rocks or floating off of the rocks, or the roots would be at the top of the water and the plants would be at the bottom of the water. So I really had to start playing with those settings and how I was toggling the various selections as I started placing all the foliage items. Unfortunately, these lady ferns were a bit of a letdown. As I placed them up close, I didn't think they were clipping. You can even see me zoom the camera in until they aren't clipping, place the item, and move on. With how the game had worked so far, I figured zooming in just changed the snapping to surface and I was in the clear. At some point, I realized this assumption was wrong, but I didn't have the energy to go in and fix all of the plants I had placed prior to realizing this, so there is a little bit of clipping, but most of the time you shouldn't be close enough to see the glitches of ferns stuck inside rocks improbably. I was unfortunately unable to incorporate this wisteria plant within my build. As I was trying to find places I could use it, the angles were just not cooperating with me. The plant had a tendency to just stick out odd from the rock, and I had to cut my losses and move on. I am pretty proud of this waterfall I was able to add as a centerpiece for the ride. I haven't had the best of success with special effects in the past, so being able to add them into this build made me feel pretty accomplished. As you watch the rafts go through the area, the water will actually splash the riders, which I felt was really appropriate for the type of ride this is. In my opinion, the water added some movement that my scenery was missing. I did realize after I placed those waterfall tops that they needed to be oriented a little, but that was a quick spin, and then the waterfall was done. This king fern is the last big chunk of the foliage that needs to be added to this ride. Overall, the root structure was a little weird for this particular plant, and these ones in particular, after I placed them, I tended to shove the root system down into the rocks a little bit. That mound of dirt just wasn't what I was looking for, but I placed them around the ride, added a little bit more texture and diversity to the plants that I already placed, and then the plants were done. I decided to add one last waterfall right by the queue. Once it was placed, I thought I was finished and began the process of saving and uploading. And then I realized I had not placed a single light. The parks are open 24/7 and absolutely are open and operating at night. While the guests don't seem to require the lights, it definitely helps with game navigation for them to be there. I figured out how to force the lighting to be dark and got to work adding lights. There was definitely quite a bit of trial and error, and I chose to include that footage. It shows a realistic view of the waffling that sometimes exists when building. If you're trying to choose an item with minimal knowledge of what exists, you may place something down only to realize it's not quite what you were looking for. Many of the lights didn't provide the broad coverage I was hoping they would. I will definitely need to do more experimentation over time to decide what lights fit with my vision of this park. I found these overhead lights which I thought fit well for over the path, but because the queue goes under portions of the ride, I had to figure a workaround for a couple of the areas. I started initially placing a bunch of these lights, and I actually went back later and deleted some because when I looked at a full overhead view of the ride, the path looked like it was in broad daylight and it just felt too bright for a nighttime setting. I feel like the lights overall were the most tedious portion of this process. I tried to place the lights at a consistent spacing, which meant I was being more careful of placement than any other item I had placed so far. With the rocks and foliage, I just went with what looked good, and that just wasn't the case with the lights. So you can tell me in the comments if you are disappointed, but I cut a majority of the light placement for the sake of video length. Once the path was lit, it was time to add lighting to the ride so that all my hard work wouldn't be invisible when the game is in the night cycle. I started with this flat wall light fixture, but it was sticking to the water, not the ride insight, and I didn't know how to get the rotation right so that I didn't hate the clipping. I decided to go with this more spotlight-shaped light, leaving it in the color blue to try and blend with the water, and began the tedious process of placing light after light. I thought maybe I could try and light up the waterfall area, but once I had placed the lights, it just wasn't quite what I was looking for. I think I would have needed something that was more of a true spotlight, and the light coverage was just strange, and I just didn't like how the lights looked during the daylight hours, so I ended up deleting all of those out. While trying to light up the waterfall, I did change the light color I was using to gray to try and blend in with the rock better, and I realized that I could use the gray light to highlight a bit more of the ride scenery and help with the nighttime visibility. Once I placed the last gray light, I was finally able to call the ride done, for real this time. Please enjoy the guest view of the final decorated ride. There was ride music, but when I sped it up, the audio became a little garbled, so I chose to exclude that for the entirety of the video to save everyone's ears from the high-pitched monstrosity of an audio file I managed to create while filming and editing this build. I enjoyed building out this ride even off of live and hope to do more builds like this in the future. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more builds from me, I would appreciate the like and subscribe or follow here on YouTube. My Twitch link is in my bio, so feel free to check out my page there. I have VODs of my streams saved to Twitch and will import them to YouTube over time. My channel is still very new, so just following and turning on notifications and giving my content a chance means a ton to me. I am hoping to utilize the techniques and even new items I've found while making this build over on stream as we continue to build out the somehow serious theme park of Disneyland Cuba. If you want to help in the final naming and branding of this ride, I would love for you to join us over on Twitch or here on YouTube for lives. My tentative streaming schedule for the upcoming weeks will be 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. Mountain Standard Time on Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday, with a longer stream planned for either Saturday or Sunday, schedule permitting. This build is saved to the Frontier Workshop as River Rider under my tag of Snow Queen US in case you'd like to download it and add it to your own park, and I hope for lots more builds to come. Thank you again for hanging out with me. I hope you enjoyed this speed build, and I'll catch you in the next video.